When they start out with, I think I know you well enough, and I just say, get out!
Yes, I'm a friend of yours, aren't I? You say, go away.
Go away.
I gotta take a break, we're coming right back. Stay where you are.
In the spring of 1976, a man walked onto the most famous stage in late-night television. The studio audience already adored him. For nearly a decade, they had watched him sit in a little box at the center of a giant tic-tac-toe board, firing off some of the sharpest one-liners America had ever heard. By every measure, this was a man who belonged exactly here on Johnny Carson's couch, the throne room of the quick wit. And yet, as Paul Lynde lowered himself into the chair beside Carson that night, something was just slightly off. The timing was a half-beat slow. The famous confidence flickered. The man who never seemed to hunt for a word was for once hunting. Here is what almost no one in that studio understood. It had taken years to get Paul Lynde into that chair. He had been invited again and again and again and again. He had quietly said no. The wittiest man on television had spent most of his career avoiding the one show built entirely around being witty. This is the story of why. And the real reason has almost nothing to do with scheduling, or nerves, or bad luck. It has to do with a secret that was hiding in plain sight on America's television screens every single week, and with a man who spent his entire life making sure no one ever caught him without his armor on. To understand the fear, you first have to understand the fame. By the mid-1970s, Paul Lynde was one of the most beloved entertainers in the country. From his perch in the center square of Hollywood Squares, the most coveted seat on the board, which he held from 1968 onward, he had become a national institution. People planned their afternoons around him. He regularly topped polls as one of the most liked stars on television. He won an Emmy, and he did it all with a persona that by every rule of the time should not have worked in middle America at all. Snide, theatrical, gleefully wicked, every sentence loaded with a second meaning aimed just over the heads of the censors. America had met him before the squares, of course. He was the flustered father in Bye Bye Birdie, undone by his daughter, and the rock and roll world crashing into his living room. He was Uncle Arthur on Bewitched, the practical joking warlock who turned every visit into mischief. He lent his unmistakable voice to a string of animated characters. But it was the center square that made him a fixture, a face the whole family recognized, a laugh the whole country shared. And what the country believed watching him was simple. They believed this was just who he was, that Paul Lynde woke up like this, that the wit was a faucet he could turn on at will, that the comebacks came to him as easily as breathing, that somewhere off camera he was exactly the same dazzling, dangerous, effortless man. That belief was the performance of his life, and it was about to meet the one stage where the performance couldn't follow him. To see why Carson frightened him, you have to understand how Hollywood Squares actually worked. In the 1950s, American television had been rocked by the quiz show scandals. Hit programs were exposed as rigged answers, fed to telegenic contestants' outcomes decided in advance. The fallout was enormous. Networks and federal regulators adopted hard rules against that kind of collusion, and audiences grew suspicious of anything that looked too smooth. Hollywood Squares had to live inside those rules. And the show had a problem. The funniest part of it, the part people actually tuned in for, was the Zingers. The joke answers the stars gave before their real ones. If those jokes were too perfect, too fast, too polished, the suspicion would come roaring back. So the show built a careful machine. A team of writers crafted the Zingers in advance. The co-creator Merrill Heater oversaw which lines went to which star, tailoring the material to each personality. And Lynde's lines were tailored most carefully, of all written for his snide, double-edged delivery, threaded with coded winks that let him flirt with the truth about himself, while staying just safe enough for daytime. The stars never received the actual questions. but they were handed numbered lists of possible joke answers ahead of taping, which they could memorize or glance at discreetly. An announcer even read a disclaimer each episode, telling viewers the celebrities had been briefed on possible bluff answers. The spontaneity America loved was to a real degree an illusion carefully engineered to stay on the right side of the law. But here is the part that matters, the part that makes this sad instead of cynical. Paul Lynde was not a fraud. He had genuine lightning-fast wit. By some counts, around half of the zingers later collected in the show's joke books were his own ad-libs. The writers handed him a net, and he was the greatest high-wire act ever to perform above one. The truth wasn't that Paul Lynde couldn't be funny without help. The truth was subtler. He had learned to be brilliant inside a frame that was built for him, prepared for him, controlled for him. Take that frame away and what was left? That was the question Johnny Carson's couch was about to ask. Carson's stage had no machine. There were no writers feeding lines, no numbered cards, no bins of pre-sorted answers tucked under a desk. The Tonight Show was live wit in real time, steered by the single sharpest improviser in the business, a host who could pivot on a word and leave a guest scrambling. For most comedians, that was the dream. For a man whose genius was half prepared, it was exposure. And so for years, Lynde simply declined. He admitted in his own words that he preferred to work from a script, that the unscripted off-the-cuff appearance wasn't where he felt safe. On the surface, that sounds like a quirk, a preference, a matter of style. But the real reason runs deeper than scripts. The real reason was control. Paul Lynde controlled everything. He controlled his lines. He controlled his image. And he controlled the single biggest fact of his life, that he was a gay man at a time when being openly gay could erase a career in an afternoon. His whole comedy was built around that tension. The double meanings, the arch delivery, the things he almost said, they let him tell the truth and deny it in the very same breath. It was a high-wire act, far more dangerous than any quiz show hinting at who he really was week after week, while never once letting the mask fall. But a coded act needs a controlled frame. It needs a setup, a rhythm, a script you can steer. Carson offered none of that. Carson was unpredictable, fast alive. In a live, unguarded conversation with the quickest mind on television, anything could slip a real answer, a real feeling, a real glimpse of the man underneath. The armor required a script. Carson handed him an empty stage and a microphone and said in effect, "Just be yourself." For Paul Lynde, "Just be yourself" may have been the most frightening instruction in the world. And then, in 1976, he finally said, yes. The reason was fitting. He had a touring stage show to promote a rehearsed, controlled act he could stand behind. Even his arrival on Carson came with a buffer. Watch how he walked in. He brought Johnny a gift, a giant, oversized pencil with erasers on both ends, a playful nod to the pencils Carson kept on his desk. It was charming. It was also a prop, a planned little bit to break the ice, something to do with his hands, a piece of business to hide behind in those first uneasy seconds. Even his spontaneity arrived pre-planned. Then on the air he admitted it. He told Carson more or less plainly that he had stayed away from the show for years because he liked having a script. He said it lightly, the way he said everything. But he said it. And then came the moments that make this appearance the most quietly human footage of Paul Lynde we have. With no writers and no zingers to hide inside, he talked about himself. He admitted he had been a terrible student, that he only graduated college through a special vote decided practically on the morning of graduation day. He talked about his father, a blunt man who was not easy to please, and about how he didn't truly get serious about his career until after his father had died. He talked about the long, unglamorous years working nightclubs in New York. At one point in the night, there was a comedy sketch, the recurring tea time movie bit with the actress Carol Wayne, and the jokes fell flat. so flat that Carson finally ducked under the counter and dragged the whole set off stage just to end it. On Hollywood Squares, a deadline never made it to air. The format, the editors, the machine all protected him. On Carson, when a bit died, it died live in front of the whole country, with nothing to soften the fall. And somewhere in that conversation, Lynde said something that lingers. He didn't believe he explained that performers should analyze themselves too closely. Talent, he felt, should stay a mystery. You shouldn't know yourself that well. It was a charming offhand philosophy. It was also perhaps the truest thing he said all night, spoken by a man who had spent his entire life making certain that no one looked too closely, including maybe himself. The control that built Paul Lynde also caged him. The same need that kept him off Carson's couch, the need to manage every frame, every line, every glimpse the public got, never switched off. It followed him home into rooms full of people who loved Paul Lynde, the character, and could not quite reach the man wearing him. The one force that ever loosened that grip was alcohol, and it did not set him free. It unraveled him the temper, the loneliness, the long nights. The armor that protected him in public left him with almost nothing underneath it in private. On January 10th, 1982, Paul Lynde died of a heart attack at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 55 years old, and he was alone. What he left behind was a decade of laughter and one strange, revealing night on a couch he had dreaded for years. The half-beat slow timing, the prop pencil, the small, honest confessions about a hard father and a wayward youth. For all his fear, that nervous 1976 appearance gave America something the center square never could: a look at the person behind the performance. Not the wicked wit in the box, just a man without his writers, without his net trying to be funny, without anything to hide behind. Because that, in the end, was the real reason he stayed away so long. It was never really about the script. It was about what the script protected. The man who made America laugh the hardest was the one who could least afford to simply be himself. And for one uneasy night on Johnny Carson's stage, we very nearly saw him. If this story stayed with you, you'll find more of them here. The secrets, the masks, and the real lives behind the faces that once filled America's living rooms. These were people who gave us everything on screen and kept so much of themselves off it. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling the parts of the story they never got the chance to tell themselves.